to support social entrepreneurs and so bring about social change. And I'd like to come back to the question whether the institutions that we have right now are actually ready to put this into practice, the vision that you told us about, because there are a couple of fundamental problems with institutions. I mean, one of the problems, and that maybe Al was referring to that, is that when you're the elected leader of a democratic institution, then you're much more concerned about the next year or the next 4 years than you're concerned about the next 3 or 4 or so generations. So you're kind of trapped because of voter expectations and just pleasing the voters. So I was wondering if you'd agree that one of the key things is actually about bringing about a change in voter expectations, so that they're ready to give up some of their, maybe some of the wealth or some of the things they've been used to consuming, because it's actually not their wealth, but it's the wealth of their children and grandchildren. And a related question, I mean, part of we're destroying the earth right now with our pattern of consumption, and part of that we can change by driving a hybrid car instead of a regular car, and it's just more fuel efficient. But I was wondering if you agree that this is actually enough by making a more environmentally conscious consumption choice, or whether we actually have to really cut down our consumption and just give up some of what we're used to having.
Yes, Winston Churchill once said that a politician thinks of the next election and a statesman thinks of the next generation. And it's quite clear, we have many politicians today and very, very few statesmen or stateswomen. Now, that was probably often the case in the past too, and that's why our ancestors, in a number of cases I know, created special institutions with this kind of future veto power, who were consulted before decisions were taken which would have longer-term impacts. You may know among the Native Americans in North America, they had this sort of seventh generation principle that every decision had to be looked at from the impact on the seventh generation down the line. In the pre-colonial Tamil kingdoms in southern India, they had institutions called councils of seers into the future, who again had a sort of veto power over the day-to-day decisions. And so in a way, we're trying to create something like this, as I said, which probably in democracy can't have a veto power, but which speaks up for the interests of future generations, which politicians who think about their re-election cannot. And that's why I'm sure that this body would, members would be elected for longer time periods, and of course they wouldn't have those challenges to face. They would have a different mandate. And I think, your second question, I think we need to do both. I think that it's quite clear that there are huge potentials for saving energy, for example. But I think it's quite clear that the projected growth in air traffic, there is no way, there is a technological fix which can solve that. I mean, if we do that, then we are destroying the world. So and of course, the argument then is that if you start taxing this, then the poor can't afford to fly, like they couldn't afford to fly 20 years ago, and it's very difficult to take away something like that. Now you can also say, well, even the poor can't afford to have beautiful houses with lovely sea views, but suddenly a new right has been established, the right to fly for almost nothing. And the longer that goes on, the more difficult it is to change it. The EU has draft directive on tourism and air travel, which says that really we need to tax aircraft fuel, not even at the rates of normal fuel, but even higher. There needs to be these fees. And Sweden, of course, is just discussing implementing such fees, and they have then done some exceptions, because some people who live in very sparsely populated regions, they say that they have to be exempted, but most Swedes, especially those who go on holidays, are going to have to pay these fees. The idea is to introduce them on the 1st of August. And of course, part of the opposition is to think, well, this might cause some airlines to go bankrupt, and of course it will. But companies are going bankrupt all the time, and so lots of corporations are going to disappear, and that's that's a problem, and that's natural. They are not serving the community, and therefore they have no right to exist. The fact that you can make money depends ultimately on state regulation, the framework which the government has created. And if we change that, then they are not going to make money. Other people are. Solar entrepreneurs are going to make money. There's going to be new technologies coming up, and the possibilities for, as I said, for efficiency is that. At the same time, students, if you just say, okay, efficiency enough, then you get all the coal producers and nuclear power producers. Then we can also become more efficient. So the focus has to be on the new technologies, I think on renewables, but also making it quite clear that maybe somebody will invent a plane in the future which can fly without causing any climate chaos. But at the moment that technology doesn't exist, and that means that certainly we're going to have to reduce and do without them. People always understood that in crisis situations, and I remember even here going to a country like Poland, for example, the discussion on this in about 91. So of course we can't expect all to fly around the world like the Germans do, and then of course that was forgotten, and now they think, well, everybody has the right to do this. It's very difficult to argue against it unless the rich country set an example. It's very difficult to tell anybody in a poor country that you can't have that. At the same time, it's quite clear that the industrialization of the world by the Western model is going to mean the end of the biosphere, and we're going to be regarded and cursed by our grandchildren as either totally mad or as criminals. So really, it's very, very difficult to say exactly where the limits will come, because first of all we need to maximize the energy saving potentials and maximize efficiency, but we also need to maximize effectiveness. Some things need to be rethought from the beginning. If you want to create a so-called circular economy where everything is basically recycled, that means you have to start at the beginning, not at the end, when you build and you construct things. And some of those solutions are there. Some might be there, some might become far too expensive, and that alone, of course, will mean that certain things will have to be cut down, not because the government says so, but simply because you are, for the first time, you're charging the full cost. And if you start charging the full cost to the climate, to our environment of transport, then it will be impossible to send, for it to be cheaper to import, potatoes from Cyprus and shrimps from India and whatever's happening. To give you an idea of the madness of what's going on at the moment, a friend of mine, one of our award recipients in the Right Livelihood Award, Nobel Hodge, she said how she'd been arguing people in England to buy English apples and not buy apples from America or New Zealand, whatever. And then she found out to her horror that English apples are flown to South Africa to be waxed, and then they are flown back again to England, because obviously it's profitable to do that. And of course, if you start integrating the costs, then that will no longer happen, and that will be fine, people buying English apples. But also some things would certainly become unaffordable, and therefore people's lifestyles would change. And I'm not sure that they will necessarily see it as a loss, because at the moment, as we see from the UX example, this explosion in consumerism is not making people happy, and all the studies about happiness shows that above a certain level, which is certainly already reached, not by everybody, I'm sure, in Estonia, but already with the Estonian living standard and with the Western living standard, at a level far below that, there is no correlation anymore between consumption and happiness. There is up to a certain level, of course. If you're starving and worrying about your children's health and falling victim to infectious diseases and can't afford a doctor, and suddenly you can afford a doctor, of course, your happiness is increased. But we've long reached that level in the West, at which there is no more correlation. Thank you.
Regarding the energy question, I have one more addition. If you think the total cost will be counted in, would you say that the nuclear power should be considered at all?
Nuclear power is a real problem and quite a complicated, because it is now presented as a solution to the climate change. And if there was really such a thing as perfectly safe nuclear power, if uranium was not also a limited resource, that might be an argument. Even if it was expensive. First of all, it's expensive. If you look at the total cost, Henri times many years worked out that for every dollar you spend on energy saving, you get 7 times as much energy saving out as if you spend $1 a billion. 7 times as many CO2 emission reductions as you get if you spend that $1 a billion nuclear power plants. Now, of course, you can't save 100% of all the energy, but at the moment, it is absolutely madness to go for nuclear power. First of all, for the reasons I mentioned, it's highly uneconomic, and the best way to prove this is if you told the nuclear power industry they have to get normal commercial insurance for their plants, they couldn't get it. I mean, the insurance rates would be so astronomous, it's questionable whether they would even be able to, whether the insurance company would actually do it. If they would do it, they would be so astronomous that nuclear power, no company would build a nuclear power plant. So basically, it's we who take the risk. And after September 11th, you have to consider that this risk has largely also increased. I mean, a plane hijacked in Moldova and crashed into a nuclear power plant in Bulgaria will make, depending on the wind, large parts of Europe uninhabitable for 3,000 years. And of course, also, even if it wasn't as bad as that, after such an accident, after the Chernobyl, popular revolt would force the government either to close down the nuclear power stations the next day and lose all that energy from nuclear, or to close down democracy. I don't believe in an age of terrorist threats that nuclear power and democracy are compatible. And I believe that there are so many alternatives which can be upscaled and upgraded. And I know that people say, oh, but look at the Finns and they have decided. Well, there were problems there, but this is a highly subsidized plant using all the technological skills because they want to prove absolutely nothing was wrong. Still, they can't encounter problems. But if there's going to be a nuclear revival, these power plants are not going to be built in Finland. They're going to be built in Kazakhstan, in India, in African countries, where the safety is much less, and where you're going to face, therefore, much, much greater risks. And also, you cannot separate, without again getting rid of democracy and creating a global dictatorship, you cannot separate nuclear civilian production of nuclear fissile material for civilian plants from production for nuclear bombs. So for all those reasons, I don't see nuclear power as part of the solution. It really is, it's a distraction from what we need to now focus on.
Okay, thanks. But related to that, what I would say about nuclear fusion, should be this considered at all?
Well, all I've seen about nuclear fission is it looks highly unlikely to work, and it's not as unpolluting as people say when you look at the leftover materials. I find it's looking at the amount of money needed and the time frames we're talking about until this is projected to work. Again, as I said, I think it's a distraction when I see how urgent it is now to invest in solar technologies in various ways, biofuels, the whole solar mix. I mean, if nuclear fission had anything to offer, I think by now they would have got much further. So I'm very skeptical that it will work. But above all, as I said, we don't have time to wait to find out whether it will or not.
In case of any need, like the need for World Future Council, the need may be pushed by negative or pulled from positive. So when you think about these needs, you certainly think about both, about the fear, various fears. You gave many examples, but I'd like to ask maybe one or two more examples you keep in mind from the positive side, what pulls.
Well, I highlighted that in my Brussels talk that you'll find here, this whole question of, you call it that. Otherwise, I'd be happy to send it to you or email it to you. The whole question of the future of Europe and the fact that Europe has now lost its way, it seems to many. The question of what would be Europe's contribution to the world based on, which is eagerly awaited if you go to Latin America, to Asia, etc. What is Europe's global vision? And it seemed to me that this is very much part on, as I said, cooperation for the best instead of competition for the cheapest. So that to me is a very positive aspect of it, from filling a real gap here with a really practical proposal. And I noticed that there was some interest in Brussels, so things that move very slowly, to think along these lines. And I mean, to me, it's just inconceivable that we should not solve problems which we can solve. And so I've always been interested in finding out why we're not doing that. And I found that with the Right Livelihood Awards, we had in some ways success that never expected. I mean, one recipient of this award, José Luxemburg, was named Environment Minister of his country, Brazil, a huge country, 2 years after he got the award. And he said to me, this is thanks to your award, because he said that has made me so internationally known in Brazil that the new president thought it was a good idea to make environment minister. And he resigned some years later, very frustrated, because he couldn't achieve so little because of the framework and all the things. So, to me, I've been, involved with this award now for 25 years, which basically says the solutions are there. It's an award for project of hope, but the hope is not unrealistic. These are working solutions. So, I'm saying, what we need in some ways is to connect the dots. Yes, the situation is unprecedented in its global threats. Never before in history have the effects of our decisions, our actions and inactions had such long-term and such global consequences. But we also have remarkable, possibilities and resources. And we have, as I said, 1 billion people in the world who are underemployed. Well, we just have to match these resources with the problems, and that to me is the positive aspect. That I know if I didn't know that these solutions existed, I would say, what's the point of creating the World Future Council? If we have actually blown it, if we have created these problems and we don't know how to solve them, then there is no point. But the fact is we know how to solve them. There is short-termism, which was mentioned, there's political cowardice, certainly, but there is a sort of institutional inertia, which is stopping us from doing it and even doing what we know. And that's, to me, is where something like the World Future Council comes in. We need to plug that gap to move from just declarations to actually start implementing them. So to me, it's a very very positive drive behind it, because, as I said, it is basically looking around, taking business, for example. I mean, we resent people who make profits out of destroying the earth, but who resents the fact that there is a young businessman, German entrepreneur in his 40s, called Asbeck, who created a company called Solar World. If you bought their shares about 2 years ago, and they have increased by several 100%. He's obviously made millions and millions. And thanks to him, we are probably going to save the lives of many of our descendants, because there is now such a demand. He worked with one of our recipients, Herman Scheer, to introduce this legislation on photovoltaics. And the more this spreads, I mean, it's already spreading so fast now that they're having finding probably for the next 18 months or so, they won't be able to produce enough of these wafers, these photovoltaic wafers. So I think nobody resents the fact that he worked closely with some politicians and got this legislation through and made a lot of money of it. Everybody's very happy, I would have thought. It's very positive. Interesting enough, what happened. A friend of mine lives in the Canary Islands, and this legislation was introduced in Spain, and so he put photovoltaic cells panels on his roof. And according to this legislation, the electricity company has to buy the surplus electricity produces according to a certain schedule, and you get some subsidies in fact, and with all the sun you have in the Canary Islands, he calculated he would have a profit over 20 years of about 10%. So he told all the others, and they said, the electricity company will never pay. So, nobody copied it. And then there was a big storm, totally unprecedented storm, last November in Tenerife. And even the water is pumped up by electricity. So once the storm was over, there was not even water. People had no electricity, all the house went off, they didn't even have water. He said, I just shifted my panel onto local use, and all my lights came on, my water came on. He said, I went up on my roof terrace and I looked out, and there was not another house with any lights on as far as I could see. And next morning, of course, all his Spanish neighbors were queuing up on his driveway to find out how he'd done it and what he'd done. So, you know, there are just some small changes like that, which one man can do. Now, what I think was something like the World Future Council could do, we could see massive changes very, very fast. You know, I always remember when people say to me, everything took such a long time. And I was in Moscow, and I was in European Parliament in May 1989. There was a conference, OSCE conference, remember the West German government representative telling his East German colleague, who was getting quite worried, don't worry, nobody in the West is thinking about changing the status of Berlin. And of course the wall fell less than 6 months later. So, you know, when the time is ready, things can move very, very fast in a positive direction too.